Good afternoon and welcome to the beginning of a Bible study I'm very excited to share with you. We are studying the infamous Mere Christianity by my favorite author, C.S. Lewis. Pastor Stecker here from Grace Lutheran Church in Nashua, New Hampshire. Thanks for joining us as we kick off this new Bible study. Now, for a quick word for those who will be joining us for our Bible study portion where we'll discuss these videos together at greater length, and to those who are reading along at home. We have sent out a schedule outlining what we will cover each and every week. If you have not received this, please reach out to our church office and we'll be sure to get you a copy. Second, as a reminder, every Wednesday a new video will be released introducing the content for the proposed chapters. The following day, Thursday, at 2 p.m., we will have a Zoom Bible study to discuss the videos and the chapters. In addition, our high school class will be discussing the video the following Tuesday evening. Once again, if you have any questions, please reach out. Also, if you know anyone who may be interested in this study, please share this video and the series with them. All right, let's dive into our first lesson. Today we will be doing four things. First, we will give a brief introduction to C.S. Lewis and the scope of what he intended with this book. Second, we will go over Lewis's introduction where he explains what he means by mere Christianity. Third, we will look at chapter 1 of the book where he lays down the foundations for the remainder of his work. And finally, fourth, we will look at chapter 2 where he takes the time to solidify his foundation by treating some possible objections. So let's dive in. As many of you know, Clive Staples Lewis holds a special place in my heart and has been a formative voice in my own Christian and educational journey of life. Also, he's often been considered the most influential writer of the 20th century. He was also known by his friends as thoughtful, engaging, simple, and a very charitable man. He was born in Belfast, Ireland, and while he had a good early childhood, when he was young, his mother died of cancer. His father was a distant man, and Lewis was soon shipped off to boarding school. This time was formative and challenging. His education was rigorous, but his life was difficult. Early on, he found an affinity for writing and imagination. During these years, he drifted from his Christian roots until finally he abandoned religious life altogether. By the time he served in World War I, he was a full-fledged atheist. However, this slowly gave way as his life continued until finally, while a professor at Cambridge University, he became a Christian. The story is fascinating, but too long for us to speak about now. It will suffice to say that Lewis considered himself the most reluctant convert in all of England, but finally saw that Christianity was the thread that tied all of life together. After this, he became one of the most influential Christian writers and apologists of his age. Interestingly, what led to his success wasn't that he set off on a mission, but more it was his ability to think deeply about a subject before speaking. He always took the time to engage friends, colleagues, and students. He was quick to listen and slow to speak. But when he did, it was profound. He didn't repeat platitudes, but thought deeply about what his faith and belief meant in every conversation, circumstance, question, or objection. During World War II, Lewis was asked to do an ongoing radio broadcast to help the soldiers who were fighting in the war. He chose to speak about Christianity. Mere Christianity, as he called it. These broadcasts were meant to speak to the soldiers fighting in war, to bring them comfort, peace, and a semblance of real life during a time of grandiose confusion and devastation. These radio broadcasts are what later became the book, Mere Christianity. When we read this book, we aren't watching Lewis attempt a grand philosophical piece. We are listening to him speak plainly, with compassion and wisdom into the lives of all who face the battles of life. Lewis calls his work Mere Christianity. But why? Lewis's goal is to discuss what the core tenets of Christianity are. He avoids purposely the aspects of Christianity Lewis calls his work Mere Christianity. Why? Lewis's goal is to discuss what the core tenets of Christianity are. He avoids purposely the aspects of Christianity that divide Orthodox denominations. Now, it's important to understand why Lewis does this. The first answer he gives, he says that he feels unqualified. that those discussions belong to priests and pastors who have studied these tenets. Secondly, he makes a point to say that this doesn't mean that he believes the divisions between denominations to be unimportant. Lewis isn't going against denominations, but he points out that the chasms between denominations are made small when compared to the chasm between Christianity and the other belief systems of the world. Finally, Lewis draws us to a really important point, and that is when he says mere Christianity. He is still resting on the confession of the creeds. Even his mere Christianity is going to be in some way exclusive because it's definitive. The reason for this, he tells us, is because Christianity is in fact a definable term. Let's explore this important point, that the term Christian does have an objective meaning. Lewis says that Christian means one who accepts the common doctrines of Christianity. He goes on to point out that some will argue this point, saying, can't someone who doesn't believe these doctrines actually be more truly Christian in action than someone who believes just the right things? In other words, even someone who's confused by the Christian confessions might have more love or charitability than someone who believes the right things. And therefore, the objection goes, isn't that person actually a better Christian? Lewis points out that this train of thought is incorrect, and he gives us a fine illustration to help us understand why. Lewis refers to the word gentleman, noting that a gentleman used to have an actual objective definition. It meant someone that had a coat of arms and owned land. So when you called someone a gentleman, you weren't giving them a compliment or expressing how you felt. You were merely stating a fact. And everyone who heard that term understood what you meant. This is a man who has a coat of arms and owns land. It wasn't a compliment, nor was it insulting. It was simply a statement of fact. Listen to what Lewis says about how the word has changed, and how that change made the word actually lose its meaning. But then there came people who said, but surely the important thing about a gentleman is not the coat of arms and the land, but the behavior. Surely he is the true gentleman who behaves as a gentleman should. Surely in that sense, Edward is far more truly a gentleman than John. They meant well. To be honorable and courteous and brave is, of course, a far better thing than to have a coat of arms. But it is not the same thing. Worse still, it is not a thing everyone will agree about. To call a man a gentleman in this new refined sense becomes in fact not a way of giving information about him, but a way of praising him. To deny that he is a gentleman becomes simply a way of insulting him. When a word ceases to be a term of description and becomes merely a term of praise, it no longer tells you facts about the object. It only tells you about the speaker's attitude to that object. A nice meal only means a meal the speaker likes. A gentleman, once it has been spiritualized and refined out of its old coarse, objective sense, means hardly more than a man whom the speaker likes. As a result, gentleman is now a useless word. Do you see how Lewis's example of the term gentleman applies to the term Christian? Christian was first a word presented in Acts chapter 11, verse 26, to the disciples who accepted the teaching of the apostles. In other words, the term Christian meant one who believes, ascribes to, confesses certain things about God. It is not a term meant to simply mean a good or nice or a caring person. It is meant to categorize a person who believes in their heart and confesses with their lips the Christian faith. If we turn it into anything else, it just becomes another word that means so-and-so is a nice guy. And if that's all Christian means, then the word actually becomes useless. Lewis then admits, as we all should, that there are, of course, people who accept the Christian doctrines but live lives unworthy of it. Lewis says it is far better to call that person a bad Christian than to say he isn't a Christian, just as it would be right to say of a man who does not confess the Christian faith, but who seems to be a very good person, that he is a good man. Notice how doing this keeps the integrity of the word Christian intact. Now, why is any of this important? Because Lewis is going to be teaching us about mere Christianity. And it's important for us to know from the outset that Christian or Christianity is not abstract. Lewis's goal is to help us understand what being a Christian means, what one confesses and why. His goal is to move the listener to the point where they can believe in their heart and confess with their lips the true Christian faith. But Lewis closes out his introduction in a great way, telling us that his goal is to bring the readers into a hallway, but that this is only the beginning of the journey. Remember how Lewis avoided talking about things that specific denominations, such as the Lutherans, speak of? Well, Lewis says, it is then the listener's job to join a church after reading his book. For in the hallway there are many doors, but it is in the rooms, not the hall, that there are fires and chairs and meals. The hall is a place to wait in, but not a place to live in. Lewis's point is important. His job, his goal is to explain mere Christianity, but the road doesn't end there. It is our job as Christians to then join a church like Grace Lutheran. Listen to Lewis's closing words of the preface as he tells us what should dictate the church that you belong to. And above all, you must be asking which door is the true one, not which pleases you best by its paint and paneling. In plain language, the question should never be, do I like that kind of service? But, are these doctrines true? Is holiness here? Does my conscience move me toward this? Is my reluctance to knock at this door due to my pride, or my mere taste, or my personal dislike of this particular doorkeeper? When you have reached your own room, be kind to those who have chosen different doors, and to those who are still in the hall. If they are wrong, they need your prayers all the more. And if they are your enemies, then you are under orders to pray for them. That is one of the rules common to the whole house. Lewis is writing primarily to an audience of people who have doubts or who have questions about whether Christianity is true. If that's you, then welcome. If you don't have doubts about Christianity being true, this study will still stretch you and should, like an elevator, bring the roots of your faith even deeper into the ground. His book is broken up into 4 separate books. The first book that we'll look at today and next week, its focus will be on understanding the law, or as he puts it, that right and wrong that are clues to the meaning of the universe. His goal here in the first chapter is to prove to you that there is a law of human nature. And he begins in a seemingly peculiar way, but one of wisdom. He begins with a quarrel. And he points out that whenever we witness a quarrel, we hear things such as, how'd you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Come on, you promised. What is telling about the flow of an argument is that both people engaged in the argument are appealing to some kind of standard. They aren't simply saying, I don't like what you did. They are saying, what you did is objectively and actually really wrong. And the other person is attempting to explain not that the standard is wrong, but that there has been some special excuse for why he did what he did. Lewis points out that quarreling means trying to show that the other man is in the wrong. And there's no sense in trying to do that unless you and he had some sort of agreement as to what right and wrong are. Now, here is why this is important. If there is not an objective right and wrong, a law as we often call it, then we can never really say that one person is right and that another one is wrong. We can't say that the Nazis were wrong and that the Americans were right to go to war with them. If there is no objective law, then we can only say, I prefer this and I dislike that. But Lewis's argument here in chapter 1 is that we can see in humanity, in arguments, in systems of law, and in relationships, that there's an agreed upon understanding of what a true right and wrong are. And this right and wrong stands true, and that all men end up submitting to it. Which brings us to our second point in this chapter. Lewis says, even though we all admit to the law, none of us really keep the law. Meaning that the standards that we have for other people, we fail at. A good way to think about this is in this way. Imagine for a moment that since you were a baby, you've had around your neck an invisible tape recorder. And the invisible tape recorder only recorded everything that you said after the words, you ought. Meaning, every time you said to somebody else, "You ought," or "You should do this." It took a recording of that. And then at the end of your life, it printed out the recording. And what it would show you is what the standard is that you set for everyone around you, what you expect other people to do, what you get mad at them for failing to do. Now imagine that you're looking at that, and now that standard that you set up was now applied to you. What would be the reaction? The reaction would probably be that what you expect other people to do, you have not lived up to. The point of this illustration is twofold. One, that we say "you ought." We all agree that there's a standard, and we hold other people to that standard, and we get mad when they don't live up to that standard. And then point two, that we ourselves don't actually live up to the standard. This is what Lewis's point in chapter 1 is. Lewis summarizes it in this way. These then are the 2 points I wanted to make. First, that human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way and cannot really get rid of it. Secondly, that they do not in fact behave in that way. They know the law of nature, they break it. These 2 facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. Because this concept of the law or right and wrong is a clue to the truths in the universe are going to be essential to Lewis's arguments moving forward, he wants to take time to consider some objections to his claims. The first, he says, may go something like this. Isn't what you call the moral law imply our herd instinct that is developed like other instincts? In other words, isn't this curious feeling of oughts and ought-nots just results of evolution, or learned traits from distant ancestors? To our high school kids, as someone who earned a degree in psychology from my undergrad, this is what your psychology professors will teach you. And Lewis and I want to tell you it's not as wise as it sounds. Lewis responds to this line of thought and this objection in this way, saying that there are instincts that we develop either from our life or from our ancestors. This is certainly true. He notes that you will notice these instincts when you find yourself urged to do something. The example that he gives is this. Suppose you encounter a man drowning and crying out for help. You will find in yourself 2 urges or instincts. First, the urge to save the man. This may well have been taught to you. But second, an urge to preserve your own life. Both are indeed good instincts to have. However, this is where the moral law comes into play. Lewis notes that outside of these 2 impulses, you will also find a third thing telling you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and not the one to run away. This third thing is not itself an urge or an instinct, but is something which rules over and judges different instincts. This is the law, the right and wrong that is written on our hearts. Again, we are given a great illustration. We might well imagine a sheet of music that tells us which keys to play in order to make music. To play one note and not the other at any given moment is what makes the music beautiful. But the sheet of music is separate and above the individual notes on the piano. The moral law tells us the tune we have to play. Our instincts are merely the keys. Lewis's point is important. His main point here is to help us see that the moral law is something that exists and dictates our lives. The person who says to someone else, "You ought to do this," is referring to that moral law, to the sheet of music per se. When we say that the Nazis are wrong, that you shouldn't be selfish, that Jack shouldn't hit Jill, we are referring to something real, to the sheet of music, to the moral law. And this point has great practical consequence. The most dangerous thing that one can do is to take any one impulse of your own nature and set it up as the thing you ought to follow at all costs. There is not one of them which will not make us into devils if we set them up as an absolute guide. In other words, there are many keys on the keyboard. Some are played much more often than others, but they are all merely keys on the keyboard. They are not the sheet of music. For example, you may think that kindness is a safe bet, a key that is above all the other keys, but in all reality, it's not. If you leave out justice or fighting for the oppressed, you can end up being a kind person that actually ruins people's lives because you don't defend what needs to be defended. Kindness, like all other instincts and actions, are just keys on the keyboard. The point being that the moral law is something that stands above all else and tells you when to be kind and when to fight for the oppressed and when justice is called upon. Last, Lewis points out one more objection which he wishes to treat. He says we must understand the difference between morality and differences about belief of facts. Remember, Lewis's point is that the moral law is real, objective, and it doesn't change. But Lewis says our understanding of facts may change, but that this is something which is different from morality changing. He uses this example. One man said to me, 300 years ago, people in England were putting witches to death. Was that what you call the rule of human nature or right conduct? But surely the reason we do not execute witches is that we do not believe there are such things. If we did, if we really thought that there were people going about who had sold themselves to the devil and received supernatural powers from him in return, and were using these powers to kill their neighbors or drive them mad or bring bad weather, surely we would all agree that if anyone deserved the death penalty, then these filthy quislings did. There is no difference of moral principle here. The difference is simply about matter of fact. It may be a great advance in knowledge not to believe in witches. There is no moral advance in not executing them when you do not think they are there. You would not call a man humane for ceasing to set mouse traps if he did so because he believed there were no mice in the house. So, in summary, our first lesson shows us that right and wrong work as clues to the truths of the universe. Our goal today was to discuss how we all, even though we don't realize it, refer to and believe that there is an objective moral law. Some of us deny we do, but the easiest way to find ourselves mistaken is to look at our arguments. Look how quickly we say to others, "You ought to do that." Next week, we will continue this discussion by looking at chapters 3 through 5 of the first book. Thanks for joining us. Take care, and God bless.